The Great War had been raging for barely 3 weeks when the British Expeditionary Force found itself positioned along the Mons Canal in what would become the first major engagement between British and German forces on European soil since the Battle of Waterloo nearly a century earlier. Field Marshal Sir John French commanded approximately 70,000 men of the 2 Corps who had crossed the English Channel with equipment, training, and tactical doctrine that reflected decades of colonial warfare experience, but which would prove inadequate for the industrial-scale slaughter that mechanized European warfare was about to unleash upon a generation of young men. General Alexander von Kluck's German First Army, numbering over 160,000 troops, advanced through Belgium as part of the Schlieffen Plan's ambitious strategy to knock France out of the war within 6 weeks through a massive wheeling movement that would encircle Paris and force capitulation before Russia could fully mobilize her vast but slowly developing military potential. The German forces represented the most professionally trained and well-equipped army in the world, supported by artillery that outgunned British batteries by factors that would prove decisive in the coming engagement. The town of Mons itself occupied terrain that military engineers had identified as tactically significant due to the canal system that provided natural defensive barriers, while the surrounding industrial landscape offered concealment and defensive positions that could channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The area's coal mining operations had created a network of slag heaps, pit heads, and narrow streets that would complicate artillery targeting while providing cover for defenders who understood how to utilize urban terrain for military advantage. Belgian military resistance had been systematically overwhelmed by German forces whose advance through neutral territory violated international law while demonstrating the ruthless efficiency that characterized Prussian military doctrine when political considerations were subordinated to strategic objectives. The destruction of Louvain's ancient library and the execution of Belgian civilians had already established patterns of total war that would define the conflict's character as something beyond traditional European military conventions. The British forces positioned along the canal included regular army battalions whose professional experience encompassed frontier warfare in India, South Africa, and the Northwest frontier, but whose tactical training emphasized small unit actions and marksmanship rather than the massed artillery bombardments and coordinated infantry assaults that European warfare demanded. The Lee Enfield rifles carried by British infantry represented superior individual weapons, but the British artillery was outgunned and outnumbered by German field guns whose concentrated firepower could devastate defensive positions. Local Belgian folklore included stories that provided cultural context for the supernatural events that would soon unfold around Mons, though these traditional narratives were generally dismissed by British officers whose education emphasized rational military analysis rather than superstitious beliefs that had no place in modern warfare. The region's Catholic traditions included numerous accounts of miraculous intervention during times of crisis, while local legends spoke of celestial warriors who had appeared during medieval battles to protect the faithful against overwhelming odds. The coal mining communities around Mons maintained oral traditions that described apparitions of armored figures who had been observed during previous conflicts, particularly during the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries when Catholic and Protestant armies had fought across the same terrain with casualties that contemporary accounts described as miraculously lower than military logic suggested possible. These stories included detailed descriptions of luminous figures in ancient armor who appeared during the most desperate phases of battle to provide assistance that turned defeat into victory. French military archives contained references to similar phenomena reported during Napoleon's campaigns, including accounts from the Battle of Waterloo, where British and French veterans had described observing mounted figures in archaic military dress who appeared to influence tactical developments without participating directly in combat operations. These reports had been dismissed as battlefield hallucinations induced by combat stress and fatigue, but the consistency of witness testimony across different armies and time periods suggested patterns that exceeded individual psychological responses. The technological revolution that had transformed European warfare since 1870 included innovations that would make the coming battle at Mons fundamentally different from previous military conflicts. Machine guns, high-explosive artillery shells, and rapid-firing field guns represented firepower that could inflict casualties at rates that medical services couldn't address, while creating tactical challenges that existing military doctrine hadn't anticipated. The industrial capacity that enabled this technological advancement also facilitated mobilization of armies whose size exceeded anything previously seen in European history. German tactical doctrine emphasized concentrated artillery bombardment, followed by massed infantry assault supported by machine gun fire that could suppress defensive positions, while breakthrough forces exploited gaps in enemy lines. The effectiveness of these tactics had been demonstrated during recent conflicts, but their application against British forces would test both German capabilities and British defensive preparations under conditions where tactical mistakes could result in complete military disaster for either side. The strategic implications of the Battle of Mons extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations to include questions about whether the British Expeditionary Force could maintain effective resistance against German numerical and technological superiority, while French forces attempted to implement their own strategic plans that required British forces to delay German advances long enough for coordinated Allied response to prevent German victory in the opening phase of what military planners on all sides expected to be a brief, decisive conflict. As dawn broke on August 23rd, revealing weather conditions that would provide clear visibility for artillery observation while exposing defending forces to accurate German fire across terrain that offered minimal concealment, the British forces prepared for combat that would test every aspect of their training, equipment, and leadership against an enemy whose capabilities exceeded what peacetime exercises had prepared them to face. The defensive positions established by the Second Corps along the Mons Canal reflected British tactical doctrine that emphasized accurate rifle fire and disciplined infantry formations, but which hadn't been adapted for the concentrated artillery bombardments and massed infantry assaults that German forces were preparing to unleash against positions that were inadequately fortified for the firepower that modern European warfare could bring to bear. Lieutenant General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien commanded approximately 40,000 men whose deployment along a front extending nearly 20 miles would be tested by German forces that possessed both numerical superiority and artillery capabilities that exceeded British defensive preparations. The 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, occupied positions near the Nîmes salient, where the canal curved northward, creating a tactical bulge that provided excellent fields of fire for defending riflemen, but which also exposed British forces to concentrated German attack from multiple directions. Captain Theodore Wright commanded C Company in trenches that had been hastily dug during the previous night, positions that provided protection against small arms fire, but offered minimal defense against the high explosive shells that German artillery was preparing to deliver with accuracy that British forces hadn't anticipated. The Middlesex Regiment held the line near Aubourg, where Lieutenant Colonel Charles Hull had positioned his men in firing positions that maximized the effectiveness of Lee Enfield rifles, whose rate of fire and accuracy represented the British Army's primary tactical advantage against German forces whose individual marksmanship couldn't match British standards, but whose artillery and machine gun support provided firepower that could overwhelm rifle-armed defenders through sheer volume rather than precision. Supporting the infantry deployment, the Royal Field Artillery had positioned 18-pounder guns in locations that provided covering fire for defensive positions, while remaining concealed from German observation that could direct counter-battery fire against British artillery whose limited ammunition supply and inferior range placed them at significant disadvantage against German field guns that possessed both greater firepower and more extensive logistical support. The tactical challenge facing British commanders involved utilizing limited forces to defend extended positions against an enemy that possessed overwhelming numerical superiority while maintaining sufficient reserves to respond to German breakthrough attempts that could exploit weaknesses in defensive lines that were necessarily thin due to the disparity in available manpower. The defensive plan required precise coordination between artillery and infantry while depending on communication systems that could be disrupted by German bombardment. German artillery preparation commenced at 0630 hours with concentrated bombardment of British positions that demonstrated firepower far exceeding what British intelligence assessments had projected. The bombardment included high explosive shells that created casualties among defending troops while destroying defensive works that had taken hours to construct. The intensity and accuracy of German fire indicated observation and fire control capabilities that suggested German artillery doctrine had evolved beyond what British tactical planning had anticipated. The infantry component of German forces included units whose training encompassed assault tactics specifically developed for attacking defensive positions protected by modern weapons. German soldiers carried equipment that included wire cutters, grenades, and supporting weapons that provided capabilities for overcoming defensive obstacles while maintaining offensive momentum that could prevent British forces from establishing effective resistance once German troops reached British defensive lines. Machine gun deployment by German forces provided suppressive fire that could neutralize British rifle positions while supporting infantry advance across terrain that offered minimal concealment for attacking troops. The German machine guns included water-cooled Maxim guns, whose sustained fire capability exceeded anything available to British defenders whose tactical doctrine hadn't emphasized machine gun employment beyond limited defensive applications. Communication systems available to British forces included field telephone lines that connected company positions to battalion headquarters, but these communications were vulnerable to artillery fire that could sever connections at critical moments when coordination between units would determine whether defensive positions could be maintained or would require withdrawal under conditions that could result in casualties and equipment losses that the British Expeditionary Force couldn't sustain. Medical services supporting British forces included regimental aid posts and field ambulances, whose capacity was designed for casualty rates typical of colonial warfare rather than the industrial-scale violence that European combat could produce. The medical personnel had received training in treating gunshot wounds and traumatic injuries, but their equipment and procedures weren't adequate for the types of wounds that high-explosive artillery shells and machine gun fire would inflict on unprecedented scales. Logistical support for British defensive operations included ammunition supplies that had been calculated for engagement durations typical of previous military experience, but which might prove inadequate for sustained combat against German forces whose own supply systems had been organized to support extended operations with ammunition expenditure rates that reflected the intensity of modern European warfare. British supply lines extended across the English Channel to bases whose capacity was limited by shipping availability and port facilities. Weather conditions on the morning of August 23rd included clear skies that provided excellent visibility for artillery observation, while creating atmospheric conditions that enhanced the effectiveness of rifle fire at the extended ranges where British marksmanship training provided tactical advantages. However, the same visibility that aided British defensive fire also facilitated German artillery targeting and infantry coordination that could overwhelm British positions through coordinated assault tactics. The morale of British forces reflected confidence in their professional training and individual weapons, while acknowledging the challenging tactical situation that placed them at numerical disadvantage against an enemy whose capabilities were largely unknown. The psychological preparation for combat included expectations based on colonial warfare experience that might not apply to European combat, where casualty rates and combat intensity exceeded anything most British soldiers had previously encountered. As German artillery bombardment intensified throughout the morning, British commanders prepared to implement defensive tactics that would test whether professional training, superior marksmanship, and tactical discipline could compensate for numerical and material disadvantages that placed the survival of the British Expeditionary Force in doubt during what would become the first major test of British military capabilities against the most professional army in Europe. At 0900 hours, as German infantry began advancing across the open ground toward British positions along the canal, several British officers reported observing phenomena that their military training couldn't explain, but which seemed to influence the tactical development of the engagement in ways that favored British defensive operations, despite the overwhelming material advantages possessed by attacking German forces. Captain Wright of the Royal Fusiliers noted in his field diary that German artillery fire, which had been devastatingly accurate during the preliminary bombardment, began displaying targeting errors that allowed British positions to remain effective despite continued bombardment. The initial German infantry assault encountered resistance that exceeded what tactical analysis suggested British forces should have been able to provide, given their numerical disadvantage and limited artillery support. German units reported engaging British forces whose defensive fire appeared to be coordinated by observers positioned in locations that provided superior tactical knowledge, but which British forces shouldn't have been able to occupy without detection by German reconnaissance that had surveyed the area extensively during their approach to contact. Private William Johnstone of the Middlesex Regiment, positioned in a forward observation post near the canal bridge at Nîmes, reported visual contact with figures in military uniform who appeared to be directing British defensive fire from positions that offered commanding views of German approach routes. These individuals wore uniforms that Johnstone couldn't identify, but which appeared to indicate senior rank, and their tactical knowledge seemed to exceed what normal reconnaissance could have provided about German formations and assault plans. The mysterious figures appeared to possess information about German tactical intentions that allowed British forces to anticipate and counter German assault tactics before they could achieve surprise or concentration of force that would overwhelm defensive positions. British artillery fire, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, achieved accuracy and timing that disrupted German coordination while maximizing the effectiveness of limited ammunition supplies through target selection that seemed to reflect intimate knowledge of German command structures and communication systems. More significantly, German forces began reporting casualties from British fire that exceeded what rifle marksmanship alone should have achieved, even acknowledging British superiority in individual weapons training. German medical personnel documented wounds that appeared to result from weapons that weren't part of British equipment inventories, including injuries that suggested projectiles with characteristics that didn't correspond to standard rifle ammunition or shrapnel patterns from known British artillery shells. The atmospheric conditions around the battlefield began displaying unusual characteristics that affected both visibility and sound transmission in ways that benefited British defensive operations while hampering German coordination and communication. Fog banks appeared in locations that provided concealment for British movements while exposing German positions to defensive fire, despite meteorological conditions that shouldn't have produced such localized atmospheric effects. German artillery observers reported difficulties in maintaining accurate fire direction due to optical phenomena that distorted range estimation and target identification. The distortions appeared to affect German equipment selectively, while British observation and fire control remained unimpaired, suggesting atmospheric conditions that defied meteorological understanding, but which provided tactical advantages that British forces were able to exploit effectively. Local Belgian civilians who had remained in the area despite the military evacuation reported observing military activities that involved personnel whose uniforms and equipment didn't correspond to either British or German forces. These individuals appeared to be providing assistance to British troops while avoiding direct contact with German forces, suggesting the presence of Allied personnel whose participation in the battle hadn't been anticipated in either army's tactical planning. The civilians described observing figures in armor that appeared to be from medieval periods, but who carried weapons and equipment that seemed to combine historical and modern characteristics. These armored figures were most commonly observed during the most intense phases of German assault, when British defensive positions faced overwhelming pressure that should have resulted in tactical collapse, but which instead resulted in German withdrawal, despite their numerical and material advantages. More disturbing were reports from German prisoners captured during failed assault attempts who described encountering resistance from British forces whose numbers appeared to exceed intelligence estimates, while displaying tactical coordination that suggested command and control capabilities beyond what British organization should have achieved. The prisoners reported engaging British troops who appeared to receive tactical guidance from sources that German observation couldn't identify, but which provided information that allowed British forces to counter German tactics with precision that suggested advanced knowledge of German plans. German radio intercepts recorded communications between British units that included tactical coordination involving call signs and unit designations that didn't appear in known British order of battle information. The communications demonstrated familiarity with German tactical procedures and weaknesses that British intelligence shouldn't have possessed, while displaying coordination capabilities that exceeded what British communication systems should have achieved given the disruption caused by German artillery bombardment. The most significant anomaly involved British defensive positions that appeared to be reinforced by personnel whose weapons and tactics exceeded British military capabilities while remaining integrated with British command structures. German assault forces reported encountering defensive fire from weapons that produced effects beyond what British equipment inventories could explain, including suppressive fire that seemed to originate from positions that observation couldn't identify. German casualties began displaying patterns that suggested engagement by forces whose capabilities exceeded British military technology while maintaining tactical integration with British defensive plans. Medical examination of German wounded revealed injuries that couldn't be explained through engagement with known British weapons, including wounds that appeared to result from projectiles that possessed characteristics beyond contemporary military technology. As afternoon approached and German forces prepared for renewed assault against British positions that had demonstrated resistance far exceeding intelligence assessments, both armies faced tactical developments that challenged conventional military understanding while producing battlefield results that suggested intervention by forces whose capabilities and intentions remained beyond the comprehension of commanders whose training hadn't prepared them for warfare that transcended normal military limitations. At 14:30 hours on August 23rd, during the most critical phase of German assault operations against British positions at Nemi Bridge, Lieutenant Robert Blackwood of the 4th Royal Fusiliers experienced the first documented direct contact with the supernatural entities that had been influencing the battle's development throughout the morning. While directing defensive fire from a position that provided observation of German advance across the canal, Blackwood reported the appearance of 3 figures in medieval armor who approached his position with tactical knowledge that exceeded what any military advisor should have possessed about both British defensive capabilities and German assault intentions. The figures wore full-plate armor that appeared to be of English manufacture from the 14th or 15th century, but which displayed characteristics that suggested metallurgy and craftsmanship beyond what medieval technology could have achieved. Their equipment included weapons that combined historical design with modifications that enhanced effectiveness against modern military threats, while their tactical communications demonstrated familiarity with contemporary military terminology and procedures that medieval warriors couldn't have acquired through normal experience. The lead figure, who appeared to hold command authority over the others, identified himself through speech that Blackwood understood perfectly, despite the archaic pronunciation and terminology that suggested origins from centuries before modern English had developed. The entity provided detailed intelligence about German tactical plans that proved accurate when German forces implemented assault procedures that the armored figure had predicted with precision that exceeded what contemporary military intelligence could have achieved. More significantly, the armored entities demonstrated capabilities that transcended normal human limitations while maintaining tactical integration with British defensive operations. They provided covering fire using weapons that appeared to be medieval crossbows, but which achieved range and accuracy that exceeded modern rifle performance, while their tactical movements displayed speed and coordination that allowed them to engage German positions without exposure to return fire that should have been effective against targets moving across open ground. Captain Wright, observing the engagement through binoculars from his command position, confirmed Blackwood's account while adding details that revealed the scope of supernatural intervention in the battle's development. The armored figures were coordinating with additional entities whose appearance and equipment represented different historical periods, but who were all focused on supporting British defensive operations through tactical assistance that exceeded what military doctrine considered possible. The supernatural entities included mounted knights whose horses moved across terrain that should have prevented cavalry operations while avoiding obstacles that would have channeled normal cavalry into positions where German defensive fire could have achieved devastating effectiveness. The mounted figures carried lances and swords that achieved lethal effects against German personnel at ranges that medieval weapons couldn't reach, while their tactical coordination with British forces demonstrated communication capabilities that transcended normal military command structures. German forces advancing toward British positions began reporting encounters that challenged their understanding of the tactical situation they were facing. German infantry described engaging British troops who appeared to be supported by armored cavalry whose appearance and equipment suggested historical origins, but whose tactical effectiveness exceeded what contemporary military forces could achieve through normal combat operations. Oberst Friedrich von Lossberg, commanding the German 84th Infantry Regiment, reported that his assault forces were encountering resistance from British positions that appeared to be reinforced by personnel whose weapons and tactics didn't correspond to British military doctrine or equipment inventories. The additional forces demonstrated capabilities that exceeded British training, while maintaining coordination that suggested integration with British command structures through methods that German intelligence couldn't explain. The supernatural intervention reached its peak when German artillery attempted to target British positions that were being defended by the armored entities. German observers reported that their artillery fire was being deflected or absorbed by effects that prevented high explosive shells from achieving normal destructive impact against targets that should have been vulnerable to concentrated bombardment. The protective effects appeared to extend to British personnel who were operating in proximity to the supernatural entities. Private James Sutcliffe of the Middlesex Regiment provided the most detailed account of direct interaction with the supernatural entities when his position was overrun by German assault troops who had achieved breakthrough against British defensive lines. Sutcliffe reported that armored figures appeared at the moment when German forces were about to capture his position, engaging the attacking troops with medieval weapons that achieved effects equivalent to modern military equipment while providing protection that allowed Sutcliffe to withdraw to secondary defensive positions. The armored entities communicated with Sutcliffe using modern English but with accents and vocabulary that suggested origins from different historical periods. They provided tactical guidance about German positions and weaknesses that proved accurate when Sutcliffe's unit implemented their recommendations, while their knowledge of British defensive capabilities exceeded what external observers should have possessed about unit organization and equipment. German medical personnel treating casualties from encounters with the supernatural entities documented wounds that couldn't be explained through engagement with known British weapons. The injuries included cuts and puncture wounds that appeared to result from medieval weapons, but which displayed characteristics that suggested metallurgy and weapon design beyond what historical technology could have achieved. More puzzling were German casualties who displayed no physical wounds, but who had been rendered unconscious or disoriented through methods that German medical knowledge couldn't explain. These personnel reported encounters with armored figures who had incapacitated them without physical violence, using techniques that produced temporary disability without permanent injury, but which exceeded what military training included for non-lethal combat methods. The supernatural entities appeared to possess detailed knowledge of individual German personnel, including information about their backgrounds, training, and psychological characteristics that allowed the entities to customize their intervention methods for maximum tactical effectiveness while minimizing casualties that weren't necessary for achieving defensive objectives. This personalized approach suggested intelligence gathering capabilities that exceeded what military reconnaissance could achieve. Belgian civilians who observed the supernatural intervention provided accounts that connected the entity's appearance to local religious and historical traditions. The civilians identified the armored figures as representing saints and legendary warriors whose intervention during times of crisis had been documented in regional folklore for centuries, though previous manifestations had been dismissed as religious superstition rather than acknowledged as historical fact. As evening approached and German forces prepared to withdraw from assault positions that had proven impossible to capture despite overwhelming material advantages, both armies faced the reality that the Battle of Mons had been decided by intervention from entities whose capabilities transcended military understanding, while their motivations remained aligned with British defensive success through methods that challenged every assumption about the nature of warfare and divine intervention in human conflicts. The climactic phase of supernatural intervention at Mons commenced at 1647 hours when German forces launched their final coordinated assault against British positions that conventional military analysis indicated should have been overwhelmed hours earlier, despite the unexplained resistance that had characterized the day's fighting. General von Kluck had committed his reserve formations to break through British defenses that appeared to be reinforced by capabilities that exceeded intelligence assessments, but what his forces encountered during this ultimate assault transcended every boundary between the natural and supernatural realms. The sky above the battlefield began displaying luminous phenomena that both armies observed simultaneously, creating atmospheric effects that enhanced visibility for British defensive operations while producing optical distortions that disrupted German artillery targeting and infantry coordination. The luminous manifestations appeared as formations of armored cavalry that moved through the air above German positions while maintaining tactical formations that suggested military organization and command structure beyond earthly military capabilities. Captain Edward Whitten of the Cheshire Regiment provided the most comprehensive account of the aerial cavalry when his defensive position came under concentrated German assault that should have overwhelmed British resistance within minutes. Whitten reported observing mounted warriors in medieval armor who descended from the luminous formations to engage German assault troops directly, using weapons and tactics that combined historical combat methods with capabilities that exceeded what any earthly military force could achieve. The aerial cavalry included figures that British personnel identified as representing different historical periods and military traditions, but all focused on supporting British defensive operations through coordinated intervention that suggested supernatural command structures that transcended normal military organization. The entities appeared to include English medieval knights, but also warriors whose equipment and appearance suggested origins from other European military traditions that had historically opposed German territorial expansion. German artillery personnel reported that their fire control systems were experiencing systematic interference that prevented accurate targeting of British positions, while the supernatural aerial formations remained immune to artillery effects that should have dispersed any normal military formation. German shells appeared to pass through the luminous cavalry without producing explosive effects, while the supernatural entities continued to engage German ground forces with weapons that achieved devastating tactical results. The most extraordinary manifestation occurred when St. George himself appeared above the battlefield, mounted on a horse whose radiance illuminated the entire engagement area while providing protection for British forces that extended beyond physical shielding to include spiritual inspiration that enhanced combat effectiveness through divine intervention that transcended normal military capabilities. The saint's appearance was confirmed by multiple independent witnesses from both armies, whose testimony provided consistent descriptions despite the impossible nature of what they were observing. German forces reported that their assault operations were being disrupted by direct engagement with supernatural entities whose capabilities exceeded anything they had been trained to combat. German infantry described encountering mounted knights who appeared to materialize from the luminous aerial formations while wielding weapons that achieved lethal effects beyond what medieval technology should have produced, yet which maintained the appearance and tactical methods of historical combat. Oberst von Lossberg's final assault companies reported systematic neutralization by supernatural forces that appeared to possess detailed knowledge of German tactical procedures and individual personnel assignments. The entities demonstrated ability to target specific German commanders and key personnel while avoiding engagement with ordinary soldiers who posed minimal tactical threat, suggesting intelligence capabilities that exceeded what military reconnaissance could achieve through normal methods. The supernatural intervention included protective effects that shielded British personnel from German fire while enhancing British weapons effectiveness to levels that exceeded technical specifications of Lee Enfield rifles and British artillery systems. British rifle fire achieved accuracy and range that approached supernatural precision, while British artillery impacts produced destruction that exceeded what normal high-explosive shells could achieve against German positions and equipment. German medical personnel documented casualties that challenged medical understanding of combat injuries, while suggesting engagement with forces whose capabilities transcended normal military weapons and tactics. German wounded displayed injuries that appeared to result from medieval weapons, but which incorporated effects that exceeded what historical combat could have produced, including wounds that seemed to heal faster than normal medical processes could explain. The psychological impact of supernatural intervention affected German morale in ways that exceeded normal combat stress, while simultaneously enhancing British confidence and fighting effectiveness beyond what training and esprit de corps normally provided. German forces reported experiencing fear and disorientation that transcended normal battlefield anxiety, while British troops displayed courage and tactical effectiveness that exceeded their normal capabilities. Belgian civilians observing the climactic engagement reported that the supernatural entities appeared to be protecting civilian population as well as British military forces, creating zones of safety that prevented German artillery from affecting non-combatants while ensuring that civilian casualties remained minimal despite the intensity of combat operations occurring in populated areas. The coordination between supernatural entities and British military forces reached levels that suggested divine command structures that integrated with human military organization while transcending normal limitations of communication and tactical control. British officers reported receiving tactical guidance that exceeded their training and experience while maintaining consistency with military doctrine and operational objectives. As German assault forces began withdrawing from positions they could not capture despite overwhelming material advantages, the supernatural manifestations intensified, rather than diminished, suggesting that divine intervention was designed to ensure complete tactical success rather than merely preventing British defeat. The entities appeared determined to achieve decisive victory that would demonstrate divine protection for British forces while establishing spiritual authority over military conflicts that involved righteous defense against aggression. The climax of supernatural intervention occurred when the entire German assault force reported simultaneous visual contact with angelic beings whose appearance transcended military classification, while whose message communicated divine disapproval of German territorial aggression and spiritual support for British resistance that served higher purposes than normal military objectives. The vision was reported by German personnel across the entire front, creating psychological impact that contributed to tactical withdrawal despite military capabilities that should have achieved breakthrough against British positions. The Battle of Mons concluded with German forces retreating from positions they had been unable to capture despite possessing every material advantage that military science considered decisive, while British forces maintained defensive positions that conventional analysis indicated should have been overrun within hours of initial German assault. The supernatural intervention had transformed potential military disaster into tactical success that preserved the British Expeditionary Force while demonstrating divine protection that transcended normal military capabilities and established spiritual precedent for divine intervention in righteous warfare. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Mons revealed casualty statistics that defied every projection based on the forces engaged and the intensity of combat that had characterized the day's fighting. British losses totaled approximately 1,600 killed and wounded from a force that conventional military analysis suggested should have suffered casualties approaching 50% given German numerical superiority and artillery advantages that had dominated the engagement. German casualties, while never officially acknowledged, were estimated by British intelligence to exceed 5,000, despite their attacking advantages and superior firepower. Lieutenant General Smith Dorrien's post-battle assessment documented tactical developments that he attributed to superior British training and favorable defensive terrain, while deliberately omitting references to supernatural intervention that multiple officers had reported, but which military doctrine couldn't acknowledge without undermining confidence in conventional military capabilities. His official dispatch emphasized British marksmanship and disciplined defensive tactics while avoiding mention of phenomena that challenged rational military analysis. The psychological impact on British forces included enhanced morale and confidence that exceeded normal post-combat effects, while creating esprit de corps that would influence British military performance throughout the subsequent retreat from Mons, and during later engagements where supernatural assistance was less apparent. British personnel who had witnessed angelic intervention displayed combat effectiveness and courage that contributed to military success beyond what training and leadership normally provided. Medical examination of British casualties revealed healing rates and recovery patterns that exceeded normal medical expectations for battlefield trauma treatment. British wounded demonstrated accelerated healing and reduced infection rates that military medical officers attributed to improved field medical procedures, while avoiding investigation of mechanisms that conventional medicine couldn't explain through normal therapeutic interventions. German forces conducted tactical withdrawal from the Mons area with discipline that reflected professional military training, but also included behavioral patterns that suggested psychological effects beyond normal combat stress. German personnel reported continued awareness of supernatural observation during their withdrawal, creating operational security concerns that affected tactical planning for subsequent operations against British forces. Intelligence debriefing of German prisoners captured during the battle provided accounts that confirmed British observations of supernatural intervention while revealing German military leadership's attempts to rationalize phenomena that challenged materialist military doctrine. German officers attributed their tactical failure to British defensive advantages and environmental factors, while avoiding acknowledgement of divine intervention that their own personnel had observed. The most significant development involved German military medical reports that documented injuries and psychological effects that conventional combat trauma couldn't explain. German medical personnel recorded evidence of engagement with forces whose capabilities exceeded known military technology, while producing therapeutic effects that accelerated healing for German wounded who had experienced direct contact with supernatural entities. Belgian civilian accounts of the battle's aftermath included reports of continued supernatural presence in the area for several days following the German withdrawal. Local residents described observing luminous figures who appeared to be conducting battlefield maintenance and providing assistance to both British and German wounded without regard to nationality, suggesting divine compassion that transcended military and political boundaries. The supernatural entities appeared to be ensuring that wounded personnel from both armies received medical attention that exceeded what military medical services could provide, while creating conditions that facilitated prisoner exchange and wounded evacuation through methods that minimized additional casualties and suffering. The divine intervention continued beyond combat operations to encompass humanitarian assistance that reflected spiritual rather than military priorities. French military observers who arrived in the area following German withdrawal documented atmospheric phenomena that persisted for approximately 1 week after the battle's conclusion. The observers recorded electromagnetic effects, optical anomalies, and acoustic phenomena that suggested continued supernatural presence despite the cessation of active military operations in the immediate area. British military chaplains conducting burial services for casualties reported spiritual experiences that exceeded normal religious ceremony while providing comfort and spiritual guidance that enhanced the religious faith of personnel who had witnessed divine intervention during combat. The chaplains documented increased religious observance among British forces that attributed their survival to divine protection rather than military skill alone. War correspondents attempting to document the Battle of Mons encountered censorship that prevented accurate reporting of supernatural phenomena, while official accounts emphasized British military competence and German tactical errors rather than acknowledging divine intervention that had determined the battle's outcome. The censorship created discrepancies between official histories and witness testimony that would persist for decades. Local Catholic authorities in Belgium began investigating reports of miraculous intervention that aligned with traditional church doctrine regarding divine protection for righteous causes, while creating theological challenges regarding supernatural involvement in military conflicts that involved killing and destruction. The church hierarchy initiated studies that would influence Catholic teaching about divine intervention in warfare. The strategic implications of the Battle of Mons extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to include questions about divine support for Allied military operations and spiritual dimensions of the conflict that political and military leadership weren't prepared to address through official policy. The supernatural interventions suggested divine approval for British resistance to German aggression while raising expectations for continued divine assistance. Photographic attempts to document supernatural phenomena proved unsuccessful, despite multiple witnesses confirming visual contact with angelic entities and luminous aerial formations. The inability to record supernatural manifestations through technological means suggested that divine intervention operated beyond physical dimensions that normal instruments could detect, though human perception could access spiritual realities. The long-term effects of supernatural intervention at Mons included enhanced British military performance during subsequent operations and psychological resilience that contributed to British ability to maintain effective resistance during the retreat to the Marne and throughout the extended trench warfare that would characterize the remainder of the conflict on the Western Front. Within 6 months of the Battle of Mons, British military censorship had systematically removed all official references to supernatural intervention while establishing protocols that would govern military documentation of unexplained phenomena for the remainder of the war and beyond. The War Office classified witness testimony under security restrictions that exceeded those protecting operational intelligence, ensuring that accounts of divine intervention remained buried in archives that wouldn't be accessible to historians or researchers for decades following the conflict's conclusion. Lieutenant General Smith Dorrien's final battle report underwent extensive revision by intelligence officers whose editing eliminated all references to angelic entities, luminous aerial formations, and tactical developments that couldn't be explained through conventional military analysis. The official account attributed British success to superior training, effective use of defensive terrain, and German tactical errors, while acknowledging British courage and discipline that had enabled victory against overwhelming odds through purely military means. Personnel who had witnessed supernatural intervention received reassignment to different units and geographical locations that minimized opportunities for collaborative discussion of their experiences, while ensuring that their military careers wouldn't be adversely affected by reporting phenomena that official policy refused to acknowledge. These reassignments were presented as normal post-combat rotation procedures rather than deliberate separation of witnesses to divine intervention. War correspondents who had attempted to document supernatural phenomena found their reports subject to censorship that exceeded normal operational security requirements, while editors received guidance that emphasized rational explanations for battlefield success rather than acknowledging divine assistance that could undermine public confidence in military capabilities. The censorship created discrepancies between official histories and private correspondence that would persist throughout the war. The enhanced healing rates and psychological resilience demonstrated by British casualties became the subject of medical research that attributed improved recovery to advances in battlefield trauma treatment and evacuation procedures, rather than acknowledging therapeutic interventions that exceeded conventional medical capabilities. The medical documentation focused on quantifiable treatment outcomes while avoiding investigation of mechanisms that suggested supernatural healing. German military analysis of their defeat at Mons underwent similar sanitization that attributed tactical failure to British defensive advantages and environmental factors, while dismissing personnel reports of supernatural opposition as combat stress responses and battlefield hallucinations. German medical records documenting unusual injuries and healing patterns were reclassified under psychological warfare studies rather than acknowledging engagement with divine entities. Local Belgian folklore evolved to incorporate the Battle of Mons into traditional narratives about divine protection during times of crisis, while maintaining cultural continuity with medieval accounts of angelic intervention that had been passed down through generations of Catholic communities. The integration of contemporary experience with historical tradition created religious narratives that preserved memory of supernatural intervention despite official denial. Catholic Church investigation of reported miracles at Mons concluded that divine intervention had occurred, but recommended discretion in public discussion to avoid theological controversies that could affect church authority and civil-military relations during wartime. The church hierarchy established protocols for documenting supernatural phenomena while maintaining institutional credibility that required careful balance between spiritual truth and political considerations. British military chaplains received guidance that emphasized pastoral care and spiritual comfort while avoiding theological interpretations of military events that could create unrealistic expectations for divine intervention in future operations. The guidance acknowledged spiritual dimensions of combat experience while maintaining focus on traditional religious teachings rather than contemporary supernatural manifestations. The strategic implications of divine intervention at Mons influenced British military planning throughout the remainder of the war, while remaining unacknowledged in official doctrine that emphasized conventional military capabilities and rational tactical analysis. Military leaders who had witnessed supernatural assistance incorporated spiritual considerations into their decision-making while maintaining public emphasis on military professionalism and technological advancement. Academic study of the Battle of Mons developed along lines that emphasized tactical innovation, leadership factors, and technological considerations while avoiding investigation of phenomena that witnesses had reported but which rational analysis couldn't accommodate. Military historians analyzed weapon effectiveness, unit coordination, and strategic implications while maintaining careful distance from aspects of the engagement that challenged materialist military doctrine. The photographic failure to document supernatural phenomena became the subject of technical research that attributed equipment limitations to environmental factors and optical conditions rather than acknowledging that divine intervention operated beyond physical dimensions that normal instruments could detect. The research focused on improving documentation capabilities while avoiding recognition that spiritual realities transcended technological measurement. Veterans of the Mons engagement, who maintained contact through military associations and reunion activities, developed informal networks for discussing experiences that official accounts had omitted while acknowledging that public discussion of supernatural intervention would be dismissed as war neurosis rather than legitimate historical testimony. These veteran communities preserved memories of divine assistance while understanding political necessities that required official silence. International military analysis of British success at Mons attributed tactical victory to professional military capabilities and superior individual training while avoiding acknowledgement of supernatural factors that could affect strategic planning and alliance considerations. The analysis maintained focus on quantifiable military factors while dismissing phenomena that challenged rational military doctrine. The broader implications of divine intervention during the Great War extended beyond individual battle outcomes to suggest that spiritual forces were actively monitoring human conflicts and intervening when circumstances met criteria that remained unknown to conventional military planning. The possibility that warfare itself attracted divine attention raised questions about the spiritual dimensions of armed conflict that military doctrine wasn't prepared to address. The angels of Mons had demonstrated that the boundaries between heaven and earth might be more permeable than secular understanding suggested, particularly during moments of crisis where courage, sacrifice, and righteousness intersected with forces that transcended human limitations. In the muddy fields of Belgium, where young men had faced death with extraordinary bravery against impossible odds, divine intervention had responded to their need with assistance that preserved not only their lives, but their faith in purposes greater than military victory, ensuring that the cause they served reflected spiritual truth rather than merely political ambition, and establishing precedent for divine protection that would sustain Allied forces through 4 years of unprecedented suffering while maintaining hope that their sacrifice served heaven as well as earthly nations.